Now, the West has been, I would say, in the midst of a number of crises over the last few years, one of them being a growing political crisis. I mean, in the United States, we see, of course, Trumpism, a far-right movement which has assumed control of the world's only superpower. And Trump 2.0 is really rather different from Trump 1.0. The restraints are truly off. But across Europe as well, whether it be the AfD in Germany, for example, whether we see Marine Le Pen's movements in France, there is the rise of a far right, which presents itself as being against the elites, often tapping into the discontent and disillusionment and real grievances people have because of the neoliberal economic system, if you like, a economic system which has redistributed wealth and power, many of us would argue, in favour of elites. But are they really rebelling against neoliberalism and that economic system? Or are they, in many ways, the logical or the next logical stage of that system? I'm really, really fascinated to be speaking to this brilliant author, Quinn Slobodian, who is the author of Hayek's Bastards, which is just a great title. I just think have a great title for a book. Hayek's Bastards, bam, race, gold, IQ, and the capitalism of the far right. Quinn, great to speak to you. How you doing?
Doing well, yeah. Happy to talk to.
Congratulations on the new book. I'm very excited about it. I just want to, firstly, look, I mean, the book obviously you wrote before Trump 2.0 ascended to the White House. Mm-hmm. What? Just give a flavour of what you how you would sum up this Trumpism, and because I mean, again, Donald Trump has positioned himself as or tapped into the disillusionment many have felt because of the economic policies of the last few years. I don't want to overstate it because there were lots of poorer people who don't vote for Donald Trump, lots of rich people who do. But nonetheless, he's tapped into that. And obviously the protectionist policies he's pursuing, this idea of American jobs being exported abroad and so on. How would you just get, what's the kind of broader context of Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, it helps to, I guess, point out that I wrote most of the book during Trump 1.0. And I wrote it then in response to the exact narrative that you just laid out at the top. This idea that in 2016, the votes for Brexit, the votes for Trump, the votes for parties like the AfD in Germany were driven by a kind of a discontent from the heartland, cri de coeur from the left behinds of neoliberal globalization. And, like it or not, these people, the Trumps, the Brexiteers, were now the tribunes of the working class, whether we liked it or not on the left. And that didn't sit right with me as a narrative, not only because it painted me into a corner myself as a leftist critic of neoliberalism, asking myself, does that mean I now have to side with the people who seem like the consequent opponents of the status quo system? But also because it only took a second glance at the actual people who were involved with leading this supposed backlash against capitalism to see that they were actually, in many cases, much more hardcore capitalist radicals than even the neoliberals that preceded them. So I think that one way of thinking about this that helps from populism studies is people talk about the supply side and the demand side. So you can say there's a demand side for far-right movements that comes from, decades of wage stagnation, precariousness, exposure to the vagaries of global competition. Then there's a supply side who acts as the voices and the mouthpieces for that discontent and for that resentment. And what do their ideologies hold internally? So if you look at Trump's advisors, if you look at the intellectual genealogy of people leading the Leave campaign, if you look at the Alternative for Germany party and its founding, you actually find people who were not ever intent or driven to the idea of cushioning people from the effects of capitalism, decommodifying everyday life, slowing down features of interstate market competition. It's actually quite the opposite. If you look at Brexit, I mean, this inside and out. But, these are hardcore Thatcherites who felt like the EU was now this smothering socialist behemoth that needed to be escaped from to take the UK global again. In the case of the AfD, it was literally order liberal economics professors who were frustrated with what they saw as Merkel's socialism, bailing out the profligate Greeks and Spaniards who needed to be reined in by returning to the Deutschmark and maybe even back to gold, as I described in the book. In the case of Trump 1.0, his biggest economic advisors, despite the campaign rhetoric of American carnage and reindustrialization, what actually happened in 1.0 was basically the 2017 tax cut, which was designed by centrally Arthur Laffer, who was literally Ronald Reagan's architect of supply side economics. So I think looking at that supply side gives us a different picture. It doesn't discredit, I think, the discontent and anger that people feel at the existing system, but it does suggest that they could certainly find better spokespeople. And by, I think, ourselves discrediting and unmasking in a way these false prophets and their, very superficial claims of helping people out in hard times, we can maybe help to clear the path for a better alternative. And I mentioned this Trump 1.0 as a way of entry to your question about Trump 2.0, because things have gotten even stranger, I think, in the meantime. Like, I think that Trump has always been a locomotive to which a bunch of people are able to attach their policies and cling on and get something through until they fall off or until they blast through. And often that means that what Trumpism is a quite incoherent and chaotic collage of different people's goals. So, there's a tax cuts here, tariffs there, hard borders policy there. And this time around, to my surprise, some of the people with, I would say, more radical visions of shock reindustrialization and a willingness to court, global economic crisis for the interest of either playing a game of chicken with trading partners, or maybe even, for some people, I think, doing a kind of decoupled autarky policy in which the United States suffers for some time, experiences a detox period, as the Treasury Secretary describes it, but then self-strengthens somehow through a process of reshoring. So there's factions at war always within the MAGA coalition. I think the Hayek's bastards faction, basically libertarians making devil's bargains with ethno-nationalists, were leading the charge in Trump 1.0. But this time around, the National Conservatives, I think, are making a pretty good go at grabbing the steering wheel.
Before we talk about the historical context, which obviously your book really just zones in on, I mean, it's quite interesting what you talk about there in terms of, because there's a divide between that base and that particular wing. Brexit, just as an example, is quite striking because you're right. A lot of the people involved were libertarian; they were Thatcherites, and the speech that founded modern right-wing Euroscepticism was Margaret Thatcher's speech at Bruges. Exactly, she said we did not roll back the frontiers of the state at national level only to have them reimposed at European level. Right. But they couldn't run a campaign like that because the polling showed that Leave or Remain voters, interventionist economic policies are popular, and in fact the big sort of very iconic, in the worst way, quite notorious demand they pushed wasn't libertarian economics. It was £350 million is going to the EU, which could be spent on the National Health Service, i.e. our state-run healthcare system. So I suppose because they can't, I mean, it's the same in Germany and elsewhere. It's not like they're emphasizing those economic policies, is it? It's they're emphasizing immigration, which they're explaining is obviously the cause of people's ills. And then they're sort of piggybacking the economic stuff, which doesn't have big popular traction on top of that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the interesting thing about Trump 2.0 is we can see how the outcome isn't really determined in advance. I mean, I think that if you think about those order-liberal economists in Germany allying with pretty mystical far-right characters like this one guy, Götz Kubitschek, people reading like Julius Evola and Italian and conservative revolution literature. It's an alliance that's tactical, that, the people who are mostly interested in like monetary sovereignty and restoring austerity hope that they can get what they want through an alliance with someone who has a more like blood and soil pronatalist program. And then you end up finding out over the years in the course of campaigns who actually ends up, seizing the sovereignty of interpretation. And often in these cases, it's actually a pretty well-established cycle with far-right radical right parties in Europe. They often begin with a more austerian economic neoliberal message, and then they tend towards the welfare chauvinist side of things over time because they respond to voter demands. It turns out that in most cases, people don't respond well to the idea of their pensions being cut or retirement age being slashed and so on. So I think it's an open field of struggle, which is kind of what makes it interesting. Is you can also see that there's cracks in those factions, but then there's also a willingness, as I describe in the book, for example, Murray Rothbard, the famous anarcho-capitalist in the 1990s, he saw Pat Buchanan, this like fire-breathing critic of globalism, as a potentially useful ally as a Republican presidential candidate, even though on paper, like this guy was the farthest thing from a libertarian you could find. Like he wanted to do protectionism, he wanted to close the borders, he wanted to reinforce traditional morality. And Rothbard was like, we can maybe ride this tiger through to some better outcome and set aside some of the differences we might have, make some compromises. And I think that's, hence the Hayek's bastards. It's people who kind of begin with more pure elevated ideas of economic freedom and interconnection, but then in the scrum and dirt of politics say, you know what, gloves are off. We need to make the kind of partnerships that we might not want to in a perfect world, but let's see how far we can get against the broader left, which is the shared enemy of both the ethno-nationalists and the economic neoliberals.
So let's do that historical context. For those who don't know, Hayek, there is Friedrich von Hayek, who's an Austro-British philosopher, economist, wrote The Road to Serfdom towards the end of World War II, which was supposed to be a kind of polemic against what he saw as the onward march of statist tyranny. Margaret Thatcher, I can't remember which book it was, she slammed down a book of his at a British cabinet meeting saying, this is what we believe. And obviously saw Hayek.
Liberty, yeah.
That was the one. Obviously saw that as a big inspiration. What I'm interested in is going back to, he was one of the founders of something called the Mont Pelerin Society, which I'm kind of obsessed with. I find them inspirational, kind of. I should explain because. Well, of course, Paul is part of it because they were true believers of what we now know as neoliberalism after World War II, but it's completely discredited by obviously the Great Depression and the genocidal war that then ensued. But the reason they're inspiring is obviously because they decided just stand your ground and never, ever give an inch, just prepare, be patient, spend decades laying the foundations for what is to come next. Obviously, I object to everything they believe in, but that obviously strategy paid off is the point. Wait for a crisis. That's what Friedman said, but you get changed in a crisis and then it depends on the impossible, so it can become the inevitable. Tell us about the Mont Pelerin Society, because they're really fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. And maybe it's worth just for, people watching who heard the word neoliberalism just like ping-ponging around and never really know exactly how it's being used. I think that, it's one of those words that is used in so many ways that there's a temptation to just like throw it in a garbage can and like be done with it altogether and just talk about something else. But the way that I try to bring it down to earth is say that people really use it in a few pretty distinct ways. So they either talk about it as like a period of time, like have we entered neoliberalism? Have we exited neoliberalism? Did it start in 1971 or 1980? So it's like a period. Then they talk about it as like a bundle of policies, like privatization, liberalization, deregulation. So you can say like, Tanzania became more neoliberal in year X and South Africa became more neoliberal in year Y. Or, more colloquially, often as an insult or a self-criticism, people will talk about how they feel like they're being neoliberal. Like, oh my God, am I too focused on, how much clout I have, how my CV looks? Am I a neoliberal? Oh God. So like a neoliberal self-understanding is part of the way it circulates. But then there's also the people who actually called themselves neoliberals. And that starts in a very specific moment, 1938 in Paris. Friedrich Hayek, among others, gets together and says, look, we need to defend the flame of economic liberty in a time when there's collectivists on the right and collectivists on the left. And even in the heartland of industrial capitalism, like the United States and Great Britain, the New Deal is on the rise, the Keynesian model is on the rise. So we need to, be the keepers of the book, so to speak. But we add the neo, it's not just old school liberalism, because we realize that in an era of mass democracy, you can't just like force the working class into things that you could have to get back to the gold standard, just liquidate half the workforce, liquidate factories. So you need to retool the state for an era of mass democracy and also for an era of post-imperial national self-determination. So what happens when Asian and African populations are also not just, can't be just shifted around at will by colonial powers, but have their own rights of autonomy and self-determination as new nations in the 60s and 70s. So neoliberalism then becomes this ongoing discussion within this group that you mentioned, the Mont Pelerin Society, where different forms and fixes for protecting capitalism from democracy at different moments become the object of focus and intense concentration. So what that is changes over the years. In the 1930s, we're worried about fascists. By the 50s, you don't really have to worry about organized fascism anymore. Now you're worried about social democrats. So that's what Hayek wrote. This Road to Serfdom. The epigraph is to the socialists of all countries. He's actually talking to his friends in the British Labour Party. He taught at the London School of Economics. He palled around with people in the Fabian Society. He wasn't, like fighting them in the streets. He was actually trying to intellectually persuade them. And what's so interesting about that conversations, and I was just chuckling when you're saying you were kind of fascinated with it, because I was like, I've lost a decade of my life reading the writings of these people. Like, I've spent untold hours in the archives at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, just like flipping through the minutes, because it's not just like fine-tuning the doctrine, actually. Like, it's not that they're just saying, like, how do we defend first principles and make sure they never change? It's actually much more fluid and kind of dialogical than that. They look around the world and they say, like, what are we most freaked out about right now? And how can we think about strategies, policies, statecraft, lawcraft that might respond best? And also, who might allies be in troubling moments against the greatest threat to economic freedom? So if in the 60s and 70s, it's global South nations organizing in a new international economic order, then you need to think about things like reforming GATT. The World Trade Organization in some way is conceived as a way to contain and encase free trade order so that you don't have disruptive demands for economic democracy from the margins. But by the 1990s, and this is kind of the starting point of the book, is the Soviet Union is dead. And you would think that they'd be like, yes, doing a victory lap, we won, it's over, let's dissolve the society. And actually, some of them did propose that. But most of them actually were really worried about a new threat. And they thought that the face of communism, as this is a phrase used often, had gone from red to green. So the environmental movement already, early 1990s, is something they're really worried about. The
watermelons, as I would describe them, watermelons. So green on the outside, red on the inside, and that the environmental movement was just a kind of the new kind of duplicitous means of sneaking in socialism.
Yeah, but if you think about their concern more fundamentally than that, it's not even. It's they want to defend the idea of endless accumulation and endless growth, and that has many foes. And actually, you could have a consequential environmentalism that wasn't even socialist, but was just questioning the possibility of endless growth. That would be just as frightening to them, to like the readers of Marx and Mao. So that's like they're very laser focused on the idea of like keeping alive the possibility of growth, and then the framework of order within which that can exist. So that was the shocker to me, was that in the 90s they were prematurely, or precociously freaking out about all the things that would be described 25 years later as like wokeism and progressive ideology. So they were worried about feminism, they were worried about gay rights movement, they were worried about anti-racism and all that stuff already.
I mean, this is really important because a lot of people look back at this era as the kind of triumphalism of the end of history. Right. The end of history is actually, I often feel a bit sorry for Francis Fukuyama, because his thesis is often misconstrued.
Yeah, it is.
He argued that an alternative system which could be sustained on a global level as a viable rival and replacement to capitalism had dissipated. Arguably, unfortunately, that remains the case in lots of ways. Unless authoritarian developmentalism is, I suppose, the other one that could now be replacing the form of the system we have. But I mean, Midge Dexter was a neoconservative at the time, and she said it's time to say we've won goodbye, which summed up the triumphalism of particularly the neocons. Who, I guess, exactly, the Cold War warriors who just saw things, I guess, as the strategic threat of the Soviet Union and all the rest of it, rather than being the kind of economic fighters you're talking about. But actually, this is really interesting because that insecurity then drives political consequences, doesn't it? Because their view is not, well, we can just, that's it. We'll just go and have our victory party now. We're the great, we're the winners. They were sore winners, I suppose, in that they didn't actually believe they'd won at all, and that actually drove the political struggles and the consequences they had.
Yeah, so I've got a couple things to say about that. One fact I always find really interesting, I actually had it in my last book, Crack Up Capitalism, is that the first thing that Fukuyama publishes after the End of History and the Last Man comes out is an article called Asia's Soft Authoritarian Alternative. So your point about authoritarian developmentalism, he was actually making himself, like, almost immediately after he said there's no options left, it's all liberal democracy, he immediately writes an article that's like, well, actually, is non-democratic developmentalism that seems to have pretty high levels of output legitimacy in places like Singapore and Taiwan. So maybe that is the alternative. And I think I totally agree with you. He's often misconstrued because he was not bullish about the end of history, right? He thought it was actually going to be, as he said, a very sad time. And the last man analogy is from Zarathustra walking around, and Nietzsche walking around to town squares and decrying the idea of a last man who will have no meaning and will just be interchangeable and will stroll around with an empty chest. And the people in the square saying, who is this last man? We want to be the last man. So for him, as a conservative, it was very depressing that meaning would have been lost in a time after struggle, after, titanic conflict between competing forms of order and meaning. But the neoconservative thing is actually really essential. And, you would in some ways count Fukuyama among those people. There's already a moment in the 1960s when neoconservatives and neoliberals kind of part ways. And there's this guy, Danny Steinmetz Jenkins, a historian, has written a very nice piece about this. And they split ways over something very simple, which is that the neoconservatives are mostly concerned about national security. So they are mostly concerned about the Soviet Union. The neoliberals are mostly concerned about economic freedom. And so for them, the threat of the Soviet Union, by the 1960s, let's be honest, it's a midget economically compared to the US. Party membership as such has completely dried up in the Western world. It was a paper tiger, actually, from an political economic point of view. So that attitude continues into the 1990s. And the people I write about in the book actually end up partnering with people called paleoconservatives who define themselves expressly against neoconservatives. So they said that neocons are saying, hooray, we won. And now that we won the Cold War, let's do democracy all over the world. And that becomes the new frontier for, as they see it, expanding the military-industrial complex, expanding the world of foreign policy advisors, and keeping them effectively in the driver's seat. The paleoconservatives are like, no. This is done. Let the rest of the world burn. We don't care about them anymore. We don't need to actually be invested in the rest of the world. Let's turn back inward and let's fight the enemy at home. And the enemy at home is not, I think, a pure phantom, because if you believe that statism is the enemy and not just socialism, then if you look at how much states spend as a percentage of GDP in 1980 and 1990, it hasn't changed. It's still, there's still big entitlements programs, Social Security, NHS in the UK. These things actually weren't dismantled by Thatcher and Reagan. They were reconfigured and, made worse for normal people and so on. But that was the new front of battle for the paleoconservatives and the paleolibertarians, is how do we smash up the state at home? Enter Project 2025, you could say. There is a through line there to an attack on the managerial state as most fundamental.
What's interesting, disturbing, is the role of racism, which is something, and race generally. Just describe I'd be really interested to describe this and talk about what happened here, because I mean, a lot of these people did actually call themselves some top, or they call some classical liberals or whatever. And I have to say on Twitter, if you ever see someone with classical liberal in their Twitter bio, you normally click on it and see quite a lot of racism. It's just quite interesting, that phenomenon. So do you want to describe just what happened, for example, with the bell curve and so on in the 1990s, and how this interacts with all of that? Because this really helps explain the phenomena that we're currently living through.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a bit of a symptom of me being a little bit too far down the rabbit hole and then managing to crawl myself out. But what I mean by that is, if you look at Hayek's writings, beyond the Constitution of Liberty, which came out in 1960, and The Road to Serfdom, which came out in 1944, his mind goes in really strange places and actually quite mesmerizing and places in a way. He gets really drawn into ideas of what he calls cultural evolution. So basically, he's attracted to the idea of people like E.O. Wilson and sociobiology, but he doesn't believe that there's a genetic basis to group differences. He has it thinking of it more in a Lamarckian sense. Like, different populations develop different traits that allow them to be more competitive in a fight for scarce resources. And then they expand their population base. So demographic growth is a sign of economic superiority and like a kind of development of the virtues that underpin that. And he develops, he kind of comes back to Herbert Spencer in a way by the 1980s and 1990s. And in his last book, The Fatal Conceit, he's just coming right out and saying that the calculus of costs is a calculus of lives. And it's like this really hardcore, like neoliberal biopolitics that he proposes. And all of that is, you could describe it as racist, but he goes out of his way to say that he's not being racist and that he's not grounding this in science or genetics. The bastards of the book take that one step further. So they say, why is he so hesitant about this? We know now with genomics and genetics that actually there's hard science here. So let's not beat around the bush. And if we accept that there are hardwired hierarchies of ability, then we can actually drive a dagger through the heart of dreams of social reform and egalitarianism. So that's what the bell curve is. 1994, Charles Murray, who was a self-described libertarian think tanker, becomes a member of the Montpellier Society in the year 2000, says some crazy stuff in the Galapagos Islands that I start the book with. But he published this book that's like a huge bestseller. It's like an 800-page book with a huge number of footnotes and appendices, kind of the Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century of 1994, like a big unreadable book that nevertheless sets the conversation for a whole year. Stays in the bestseller list for a whole year. And the argument of that book is basically, the skull measures were right, basically, that IQ is real and it's the biggest correlative factor with economic outcomes. And there are stubborn and uncorrectable group differences in IQ that fall down along the lines of race, specifically black-white differences. So we need to stop doing all the stuff we've been doing since the 60s, the Great Society reforms, the Department of Education, Head Start, early childhood nutrition, free breakfast, things like that. Things that liberals have been obsessing about for a long time, and conservatives had too in many ways. And we need to start, as they say, living with inequality. So if you can restore the false foundation of race science underneath your political philosophy, then you've solved at one blow a lot of the demands coming from the left. And they saw that was what they were doing expressly. So that's where I'm sure many of us notice, and especially those of us cursed with spending too much time online for the last decade or so, when you see right-wing accounts and there's often just crazy graphs and charts, and they seem obsessed with this idea of being able to scientifically verify their prejudices. And that idea of a convergence of scientific racism with people who are often, avowed anti-socialists and anti-egalitarians, and then the more mystical sides of the far right. It was the toxic stew that we, of course, refer to as the alt-right. And there are, as I describe in the book, just important and interesting genealogies that tell us how someone got from point A to B? How did Peter Brimelow go from being a British financial journalist in Toronto talking about interest rates to founding the most important anti-immigrant nativist website of the early 2000s, vdare.com? It can look like psychosis, psychotic break or something. My point in the book is to say, no, the far right does have a capitalism. It does have an economic rationality. Some people are trying to develop ideas of what I call the ethno-economy and not just an ethno-state.
I mean, I guess, if your political project is defending and rationalizing inequality and your opponents are there trying to defend and champion equality, then coming up with a scientific rationalization for the inevitability of inequality is a way of as you see it, permanently defeating your opponents. Is like, well, what you're saying is just it's irrelevant because that's what the science says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So internally, it's a hammer blow on its own terms. Mm-hmm. But I think that would only work if there was a broader intellectual context that make that plausible. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things I was interested in as well, is trying to historicize the 1990s a bit, because I think it was a decade where there was a rising prestige of things like neuroscience. The Human Genome Project is completed in the 1990s. It was declared the decade of the brain in the United States. So the idea that you could, and then of course, talk about the information economy, the knowledge economy, the idea that the future of the American economy was going to be people like manipulating objects and rotating things on screens, which ended up being true, meant that IQ racism became a very appropriate racism for that moment, and was able to tap into like this middle brow fascination with pop science being like an easy explanation for all of society's, wicked problems.
What's going on with gold?
Oh man. Well, since Nixon took the United States dollar off the gold standard that had persisted in 1971, all other countries, and maybe not everyone knows this, is like the gold standard was standard for industrialized countries in the late 19th century. The First World War ended that. They tried to reassemble it after the First World War. Didn't really work, partially because of democracy, because the things you had to do to adjust often were on the backs of people who would then throw out of power whoever made them adjust like that. So after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods system was a weird one where the US dollar remained pegged to gold, and then all other countries had fixed but floating adjustable exchange rates. So that's what the IMF was originally for, as if, you needed to devalue or revalue, you would go to the IMF and they would help that happen. But the US stayed, steadily with the same price of gold for the dollar across almost 30 years. When Nixon took the dollar off gold, a whole new kettle of problems opened for neoliberals who were concerned with monetary stability. This is where Milton Friedman's idea of the need to govern the central bank through a mechanical type rule to avoid the discretion of central bankers who might, under pressure from politicians, say, like, let's lower interest rates, let's make things a little easier for the people for the upcoming campaign or whatever. He thought you should just be able to lock in a rule where the money supply expands at a steady but incremental rate. Other neoliberals, though, were more hardcore, and they thought that that was like the beginning of the end, basically, that once you detach the dollar from hard material backing, you've basically given carte blanche to politicians to make the money printers go burr for whatever thing they wanted. And it was the road to what they call monetary socialism. So there was a small but persistent wing of what people call gold bugs who thought that you needed to basically go back to the gold standard. And for a long time, they were pretty marginal, like seen as, crackpots, basically, for a really good reason, which is if you tried to do that, you'd basically destroy the capitalist system as we have it now. Like, it relies on liquidity, fractional reserve banking, the ability of commercial banks to make money at the snap of their fingers when they make a commercial loan or give someone a mortgage. Like, that's how we've had this crazy, half century of growth anyway, since the 70s. But in the 1990s and into the 2000s, especially with the creation of the euro, you get this small but ever louder voice of people saying like, this is really a mistake. The fiat currency itself is the road to serfdom. And so we need to go back to the shiny metal of gold. And the reason I was interested in them was not just because they're part of this idea of the need to kind of return to nature, the same way I'm talking about the return to some ideas of natural difference, the brain being determinative of human outcomes, but also because the ecosystem of gold bugs has a lot of resemblances with, I think, of the new politics that we're seeing the last couple of years. So it's an entrepreneurial, catastrophe-based libertarianism, basically, which is like you predict the coming apocalypse. This is all going down. The collapse is coming, and the elites are going to get us. Central bankers are allying with whoever else. And here I have the remedy with the other hand, and you can buy your Krugerrands and your Canadian maple coins from me at a commission. So I will insulate you from the coming threat. And by buying this coin, you will then be part of an elect group, kind of aristocracy of the soul, and we will be able to rebuild after the ruins. So the way that, especially young men are addressed by like crypto hustlers is very similar to the way that gold bug hawkers have worked for decades, which is both an economic kind of just pecuniary profit-making activity, but also a political one. Like it's one where the idea of making money and getting politics right are one and the same, which, I mean, talking about things I couldn't have predicted, the way that like the Trump token and the Trump meme coin now operates in the United States political system is like the most extraordinary like validation of this idea where, the chance for a payday and the chance for political victory are completely collapsed with no scrim of like ideological justification between.
Finally, with the context of your book, I mean, where do you see things heading as things stand? I mean, I look, we've got obviously Trump 2.0 has a long way to run. We've got the likes of the Austrian Freedom Party who are hurtling towards power, more extreme than ever. If you go to Austria, as I have, they would make that. I mean, they are more extreme than ever. They think they're more extreme than Viktor Orban. He's another interesting example because he's seen as a template. Viktor Orban's autocratic regime in Hungary. The AfD, of course, have just got their best ever result. The Marine Le Pen is. Some might, well, I mean, she's closer to power than she's got, well, she's not, sorry, her personally. Her party, though, has a very good shot at power at the next election. She's been barred from running. I mean, we see Nigel Farage. I mean, you wouldn't bet against him not becoming prime minister in Britain in 2029, incidentally. Where do you see, given, all these ascendant political phenomena, where do you see things heading in the West?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is, and you know this better than anyone having been, on the front line of the peaks and valleys of British politics over the last decade. But I mean, things change in rapid and unexpected ways, right? So we're having the conversation we're having now about MAGA 2.0 because of a vote swing of 50,000 votes, maybe like in the Midwest. So if Kamala Harris was in power right now, we'd be having a different conversation about what it means for the transition, the energy transition to be filled with all kinds of contradictions and compromises, et cetera. So I think that's the first thing to say is I don't think anything is determined in advance. I think there's a couple scenarios. One is that as with the Canadian election outcome, the Australian election outcome, you get a kind of backlash effect where there is a liberal international order minus USA effect that ends up kind of rebooting 90s style multilateralism. I mean, it's really not for nothing that the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, which had been negotiated for 25 years, finally sealed in December after Trump's election. A very 90s style, NAFTA style trade agreement. So does that happen as they're do actually the AfD and the Freedom Party get somewhat the brakes put on them? We know that Musk stepping in for AfD didn't exactly supercharge their numbers. The last thing I saw was that 98% of Germans wouldn't buy a Tesla, which is Kim Jong-un level numbers, which is pretty impressive on Musk's part to create that kind of unity in Germany. So I think that's, one, let's say, hopeful possibility, which as we know, to like long for, 90s style elite closure around like rearmament and, putting to bed any dreams of actually consequential climate change addressing and putting aside all matters of humanitarianism and the rights of persecuted peoples is not great. But the other alternative, I suppose, is Mega 2.0 does start like an autocratic wave of cascading effects in which the EU doesn't dissolve, but becomes, as someone like Meloni and Orban would like it to be, just a far right version of a federation in which more 90s style neoliberals are the minority and have to dance to the tune of the people who have zero interest in political and civil freedom, moderate interest in economic freedom, but mostly interested in concentrating their own power. So I don't know. I think, my mood changes from week to week, to be honest. Like, I think that a month ago, the total ignoring of the guardrails of the different branches of government in the United States was seemingly hurtling forward at full speed. But even recently, there's been, some reversals of judgments, some attention to the disruption of the financial markets and so on. So I think that probably we're just going to muddle from one crisis to another. And meanwhile, lives are destroyed and irreversible levels of carbon are put into the atmosphere, and we all march towards our eventual doom.
True place for Saul to start to end the conversation there. Uplifting, but I mean, it is what it is, I guess. Got to work with the material we've got, guys. But brilliant stuff, honestly, Quinn. Really, really insightful, very thought-provoking, very provocative. Really brilliant book, by the way. Do make sure you get a copy of Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. It really is very insightful in terms of, well, in its own terms, but just placing our current turmoil in the context in which it deserves. And I think you realize when you read books like this just how dire the offering is in most amongst most of our political commentators in terms of just situating events in their proper context, and actually, unfortunately, leaving us in the dark about what's actually really happening. But so press like and subscribe, leave your thoughts and your comments. Do share the video, everyone, so everyone can hear what Quinn has to say about the moment about Hayek's Bastards. But Quinn, honestly, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Owen.